Most people know Maddox Jolie as Angelina Jolie's first son. But that may be the least interesting part of his story. Because while millions of people were watching Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie in front of the cameras, Maddox was learning what happened behind them. And years ago, when he was still a teenager, he stepped onto a movie set with his mother. Not as a celebrity guest, not simply as Angelina Jolie's son. He was given real work. He sat in production meetings. He helped prepare for shoots. He reviewed footage. And he eventually received an executive producer credit on First They Killed My Father, Angelina's deeply personal film about Cambodia. That moment may have been easy to overlook, but it could have been the beginning of something much bigger. Because Maddox was trying to become the next Brad Pitt. He was chasing the spotlight. He was learning how to create stories from behind the camera. And now, at 25, that early interest looks very different. The boy who once followed his mother onto a Cambodian film set has grown into a young adult with experience in filmmaking and production. His story has moved far beyond being one of Hollywood's most famous celebrity children. So how did Maddox go from a child adopted from Cambodia to working alongside one of Hollywood's most famous directors, and eventually finding his own place in the world of filmmaking? And perhaps the biggest question is this: was Angelina Jolie simply teaching her son about movies? Or was she helping him discover his own career? Because the story of Maddox Jolie isn't really about growing up famous. It's about what he chose to do with that fame. And the answer may have been hiding behind the camera all along. Before Maddox became Angelina Jolie's filmmaking partner. Before he appeared on Hollywood red carpets. And long before he received an executive producer credit, there was a little boy in Cambodia. Maddox Chivan was born on August 5, 2001, in Battambang, Cambodia. For the first 7 months of his life, he lived in an orphanage. Then in 2002, Angelina Jolie came to Cambodia. She had already developed a deep connection with the country after filming Lara Croft Tomb Raider there. But during that visit, something happened that would change both of their lives. Angelina met Maddox, and she decided to adopt him. Years later, she described the moment as something she immediately felt. She had found her son, but Angelina didn't want Maddox to grow up simply knowing Cambodia as the place where he was born. She wanted him to understand where he came from. And that became increasingly important as Maddox grew older. Cambodia was not just a chapter in his birth story. It became part of his identity. Angelina had spent years working with Cambodian communities and supporting humanitarian causes there. And Maddox would eventually develop his own connection to the country. But there was a difficult history waiting beneath that connection. The Khmer Rouge regime had devastated Cambodia between 1975 and 1979. Millions of Cambodians died during that period. And for Maddox, this was simply a chapter from a history textbook. It was part of the history of his homeland. So when Angelina began working on First They Killed My Father, the project became deeply personal. The film was based on Laung Ung's memoir about surviving the Khmer Rouge as a child. It was filmed in Cambodia. It was made primarily with Cambodian actors and crew. And it told the story in Khmer. But there was one person Angelina especially wanted to be part of the process. Her son. At first, the project had been discussed years earlier. Then Maddox reached a point where he felt ready. According to Angelina, it was Maddox who eventually said he was ready to make the film. He read the script. He offered notes. And he participated in production meetings. Suddenly, something remarkable was happening. A teenager who had been born in Cambodia and raised by one of Hollywood's biggest stars was returning to the country of his birth. But this time, he wasn't returning simply as Angelina Jolie's son. He was returning as part of a Cambodian film crew. And that experience would change the way he saw both his heritage and perhaps his own future, because Maddox was standing on the sidelines. He was learning how a movie was actually made. Meetings, preparation, shooting, reviewing footage, and eventually an official credit. At just 16 years old, Maddox was credited as an executive producer on First They Killed My Father. That credit might have looked like just another Hollywood title, but the story behind it was much more meaningful. For Maddox, this was a return to the country where his life began. And for Angelina, it was an opportunity to see her son connect with his heritage in a way she couldn't force. She later said she never wanted Maddox to feel that he had to love Cambodia simply because he was born there. The connection had to happen naturally, and during the making of the film. It seemed to, but there was something even more important happening. Maddox was just learning about his past. He was discovering a possible future. Because this was the moment when Angelina Jolie's son began to discover what it meant to work behind the camera. And that would become the foundation for everything that came next. At 16 years old, most teenagers are thinking about school, friends, and what they want to do after graduation. Maddox Jolie was doing something very different. He was sitting in production meetings for a major feature film, reading scripts, giving notes, helping prepare shoots, and reviewing footage. The film was First They Killed My Father, and it was about to become one of the most important projects of Maddox's young life. The story was deeply personal. The film was based on Laung Ung's memoir about surviving the Khmer Rouge regime in Cambodia. And Cambodia was not just the setting. It was Maddox's birthplace. Angelina Jolie had first developed her connection with Cambodia while filming Lara Croft Tomb Raider. She later adopted Maddox from Cambodia in 2002. So when Angelina decided to bring Laung Ung's story to the screen, she knew this project would mean something different to her son. But she didn't want to force that connection. She wanted Maddox to choose it for himself. And eventually, he did. Angelina later explained that she had told Maddox that when he was ready, they could tell Laung's story together. Then one day, Maddox came to her and said he was ready. That decision changed everything. Maddox didn't simply visit the set. He became involved in the filmmaking process. He read the script. He helped with production notes. He attended meetings. He prepared for shoots. And he reviewed daily footage. His role became official when he received an executive producer credit on the film. But perhaps the most surprising part was what Angelina said about working with him. She revealed that Maddox's production notes were sometimes better than hers. For a 16-year-old working on his mother's movie, that was an extraordinary compliment. And there was another side to their experience. Maddox spent months in Cambodia. He was simply watching his mother direct. He was surrounded by Cambodian actors, Cambodian crew members, and people who understood the history of the country in a way that few outsiders could. Angelina later said that seeing Maddox working alongside his fellow Cambodians was deeply meaningful to her. He was just learning how to make a movie. He was reconnecting with his own heritage. And Maddox seemed to embrace that experience. When asked what he loved most about Cambodia, he pointed to the people. He also said he was proud to be Cambodian. That matters, because First They Killed My Father was simply the first major filmmaking credit on Maddox's resume. It brought together three parts of his life: his mother, his birthplace, and his growing interest in filmmaking. For Angelina, the movie was a deeply personal project. For Cambodia, it was a story about a painful chapter in its history. And for Maddox, it may have been the first time he discovered what it felt like to contribute to something much bigger than himself. He was acting. He was trying to become famous. He was learning how an entire film comes together from behind the camera. And that distinction would become important, because Maddox could have used his family's fame to stand in front of the camera. Instead, he seemed increasingly interested in understanding what happens behind it. That first experience would not remain an isolated chapter. Years later, Maddox would continue working behind the scenes on his mother's film projects. And slowly, the boy who once arrived on a movie set as Angelina Jolie's son was beginning to look like someone who actually belonged there. But was filmmaking really becoming Maddox's career? Or was he simply helping his mother? The answer would start to become clearer with the projects that came next. For Maddox, First They Killed My Father could have been a one-time experience, a meaningful project, a connection to Cambodia, a chance to work alongside his mother, and then move on. But he didn't. Instead, Maddox kept going back behind the camera. And that is where his story starts to become much more interesting. Because there is a major difference between being Angelina Jolie's son on a film set and actually learning how a film gets made. After his experience on First They Killed My Father, Maddox continued exploring production work. He later worked behind the scenes on Maria, the 2024 film starring Angelina Jolie as opera legend Maria Callas. And then came Couture. This time, Maddox's role had grown. He was simply watching. He was working in the assistant director department. And his name appeared in the film's credits as a third assistant director. That may sound like a small credit, but it represents something important. A third assistant director is part of the machinery that keeps a film production moving. Schedules, communication, coordination, making sure the right people are in the right place at the right time. It is not glamorous. It is not the kind of job that puts your face on a movie poster. But that's precisely what makes Maddox's path so interesting. He appears to be learning filmmaking from the ground up. And his mother isn't treating him simply as her famous son. She is working with him as part of a professional crew. That relationship became even more visible during the making of Without Blood. Angelina directed and produced the film, and during production in Italy in 2022, Maddox and his brother Pax worked behind the scenes in their assistant director department. Angelina later described working with her sons as natural, saying that a film crew at its best can feel like a family. Think about how different that is from the image most people have of celebrity children. Usually, the story is about children following their parents into fame. Acting, modeling, music, red carpets. But Maddox seems to be taking another route. He is learning the work behind the fame. And that distinction matters, because being famous is something Maddox inherited. But filmmaking is something he has to learn. There is also a fascinating moment from Angelina's recent work on Couture. In an interview with Harper's Bazaar, Jolie revealed that Maddox helped her practice her French lines for the film because his French was much better than hers. That tiny detail says a lot. The mother who once introduced a little boy from Cambodia to Hollywood was now turning to that grown son for help with her own work. The relationship had changed. Maddox was no longer simply the child watching his mother build a career. He was becoming someone she could actually collaborate with. And that may be one of the most remarkable parts of their story. Angelina Jolie has spent decades being the person everyone else looks to. The actress, the director, the producer, the Hollywood icon. But behind the scenes, one of the people helping her now is the son she adopted more than 2 decades ago. And Maddox appears to be building his own experience one production at a time. From Cambodia, to First They Killed My Father, to Maria, to Couture, and behind the scenes of Without Blood. The pattern is becoming difficult to ignore. Maddox isn't simply visiting his mother's movie sets anymore. He's working on them. And at 25, the question is no longer whether Maddox is interested in filmmaking. The bigger question is, What happens when Angelina Jolie's son finally steps out from behind his mother's shadow and starts building a filmmaking career of his own? Because the next chapter may be the most important one yet. At 25, Maddox Jolie is no longer the little boy the world first saw beside Angelina Jolie. He is an adult. And more importantly, he now has something that cannot simply be inherited from his parents. Experience. For years, Maddox has been quietly learning the filmmaking business from behind the camera. And his latest work suggests that this may be more than a passing interest. In 2024, he worked behind the scenes on Maria, the film about opera legend Maria Callas, starring his mother. Then came Couture, and this time his role became even more specific. Maddox was credited as a third assistant director. That is a very different position from simply visiting a movie set. An assistant director is part of the production machine. The job involves helping coordinate people, schedules, scenes, and the countless moving pieces that have to come together before a camera can roll. It may not be glamorous, but it is real filmmaking work. And that detail makes Maddox's story more interesting. Because he isn't building his identity by standing in front of the camera. He's learning how to make the camera work. And there is something else happening at the same time. Maddox is working alongside people who have spent years in the film industry. He is learning the language of production, the discipline, the pressure, the organization, and the reality that filmmaking is much more than what audiences see on screen. Than there is without blood. The film was directed and produced by Angelina Jolie and is scheduled for theatrical release in September 2026. During production in Italy, Maddox and his brother Pax worked behind the scenes in the assistant director department. Angelina later described working with her sons as something that felt natural on a film set. That may be one of the clearest signs, yet that filmmaking has become part of Maddox's world. But there is an important distinction. We shouldn't call Maddox an established Hollywood filmmaker yet. That would be premature. He is still building his resume. He is still learning. And at 25, he is still at the beginning of his professional journey. But that is precisely what makes his story worth watching. Because Maddox has already crossed an important line. He is no longer simply Angelina Jolie's son, working on Angelina Jolie's movies. He is accumulating actual experience behind the scenes. And there is another detail that makes this chapter even more fascinating. In Couture, their official credits list him as Maddox Jolie rather than Maddox Jolie Pitt. That detail has received plenty of attention. But perhaps the more interesting question is not what name appears in the credits. It's what the credit itself represents. Maddox is building a resume. One production at a time. One department at a time. One lesson at a time. And when you look back at the teenager who first worked on First They Killed My Father, the progression becomes clear. Cambodia. His mother's film. Executive producer. Production assistant. Assistant director. And now, 25 years old and still moving forward. There is no guarantee that Maddox will eventually become a director. He may choose producing. He may remain behind the scenes. He may move into another part of the industry entirely. We simply don't know. But one thing is becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Maddox doesn't appear to be trying to use his family's fame to become a star. Instead, he seems to be learning the craft. And that may ultimately become the most important part of his story. Because someday, if Maddox does make a major film of his own, people will probably say he was given an extraordinary opportunity because he was Angelina Jolie's son. And perhaps that's true, but opportunity is only the beginning. The harder part is proving that you belong there. And Maddox has now spent years learning what happens behind the camera. Which leaves us with one final question. After everything he has learned from Angelina Jolie, What kind of filmmaker could Maddox become when he finally steps out on his own? For most of his life, Maddox Jolie has been known because of someone else. Angelina Jolie's first son, Brad Pitt's eldest child, the little boy from Cambodia who became part of one of the most famous families in Hollywood. But at 25, that description is becoming incomplete, because Maddox has spent years quietly building something of his own. A career behind the camera. His journey began with First They Killed My Father. At just 16, Maddox was credited as an executive producer on the film, working with Angelina Jolie on a story connected directly to his Cambodian heritage. He attended meetings, helped prepare shoots, and reviewed footage. That was more than a celebrity child visiting his mother's set. It was his first major step into filmmaking. And the journey didn't end there. Maddox later continued working behind the scenes on Angelina's projects, including Maria and Couture. People reported that his involvement had grown as he moved from his early experience as a young producer toward production work on later films. Then came Without Blood. The film, directed and produced by Angelina Jolie, was filmed in Italy. And Maddox and his brother Pax worked behind the scenes in their assistant director department. Now, years after that first experience in Cambodia, Maddox was still doing what he had chosen to do from the beginning. He was staying behind the camera. Angelina has described working with her sons as natural, saying that when a film crew works well, it can feel like a family. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of Maddox's story. He didn't need to become a movie star. He already had access to that world. He could have walked onto a red carpet and instantly attracted attention. Instead, he chose the part of filmmaking most people never see. The schedules, the preparation, the coordination, the long hours, the pressure, the work that happens before an audience ever sees the finished film. And now, at 25, Maddox has something much more valuable than celebrity status. He has experience, but there is still a question hanging over his future. Will he eventually direct his own films? Will he become a producer? Will he continue working behind the scenes? Or will filmmaking simply become one chapter of a much bigger life? Nobody knows yet. And perhaps that's exactly how Maddox wants it. Because unlike many celebrity children, he has never seemed desperate to tell the world what his next move will be. He has simply kept working. And that makes his story different. Maddox was born into Hollywood. But he didn't have to become Hollywood. He was given a famous family name. But he has been building a professional identity through actual work. He was born in Cambodia, then raised in a family followed by cameras everywhere. And eventually, he found his own way to stand behind one. That journey is still unfinished. But look at the progression. A little boy from Cambodia. A teenager discovering filmmaking. An executive producer at 16. A young man learning production. A 25-year-old working behind the scenes on major films. And now, perhaps, the beginning of a career that could eventually exist completely outside his mother's shadow. Because one day, Maddox may make something that has nothing to do with Angelina Jolie. And when that happens, people may still introduce him as her son. But the work will have to speak for itself. And maybe that's exactly what Maddox has been preparing for all along. He was born into one of Hollywood's most famous families. But he chose to learn the craft from behind the camera. And after 25 years, the most interesting chapter of Maddox Jolie's story may not be what he has inherited. It may be what he creates next.